Hi, once again, this is Joan Gore, conducting the AIEA Video Archive project that is designed to take people of my generation and discuss with them the arc of the development of international education in American higher education and their contributions to that arc. And I'm very pleased today to have Dr. Earl Kellogg, who is Professor Emeritus from University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, who concluded his career at Champaign-Urbana as the Associate Provost of International Affairs, and who has gone on to do a variety of other things, most recently including being the Senior Vice President and Chief International Officer of Strategic Consultants. So Dr. Kellogg has had a very varied career, beginning as long ago as when his hair and mine were not white, and has really seen massive change in the field of international education. And so I think I will ask you a little bit about, we've talked about where you are now. Tell me about the beginning and how you even got into something that, as we said before, didn't even exist really, the profession, if you will, of international education.
Well, that's true, and I think I thought about this a bit myself, because I've had a lot of students come to me and say, we really want you to help us, advise us on our career development.
Right.
And I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking, I have no idea how my career developed. I couldn't have predicted it, so how do I advise you? But I think, as I've reflected on this, and it's an important element in my life at least, I was in the U.S. military, as most of us who were young had to be in the United States in those years, and I was off in Southeast Asia, and I saw the horrible way different countries treated each other in times of disagreement and conflict. And for some reason it struck me at that point, there's just got to be better ways to do this. And it wasn't just those countries not understanding the United States. Clearly the United States didn't understand those countries and the kinds of... And I had one experience that was so meaningful to me that really began me on a quest to do international kinds of things in my life. We had actually jumped into the mountains of China, Taiwan, and that time just as an exercise. And the colonel of this battalion asked me to host a baseball game for the local high school that lived up in the mountains of these young people and the soldiers that were in our unit. And so, I don't know why he asked me, but he did. And so we put this baseball game together, and it was an interesting intercultural affair. They didn't speak English, we didn't speak Chinese, but Mandarin. But they beat us very soundly.
At baseball?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Absolutely, they were really good.
Yeah.
And you know, we had a ragtag bunch of soldiers. So I invited them all to my tent. We were staked out in the mountains, and to talk afterwards, and with their Mandarin and my English, we managed to communicate a little bit. And I will never forget one of the questions. This was in 1964. One of the questions they asked me is, why do you kill all the black people in America?
Oh my gosh.
And that hit me like
oh my God, I know exactly what they had been seeing.
Yeah, and I began to realize that they saw this and they kind of assumed things, and
right.
And I realized they have partial truth, but they certainly don't have all the truth. And I'm thinking, what is it about their cultures and countries that I think partial truth about, etc. So it struck me at that point, there's just got to be a way to become more professionally involved in working on these great misunderstandings that weren't just inconvenient, they led to violence and conflict and so on. So I went back and went to graduate school, and that I was very fortunate in my graduate work. I was doing a PhD in agricultural economics, and my major professor was a very famous professor, and he did a lot of international development collaboration. So I did a lot of work in Africa as a graduate student. But I was focused on being an agricultural economist. I wasn't focused on being an international education leader.
Right.
And so, but I had this great opportunity. He took me with him. And so I spent a lot of time in Africa working on significant issues in the economics of agricultural development, graduated, and then got a professorship at the University of Illinois. And I remember in those early years, there was no international education office. There was no thinking about this. And I began to say, there's something here, even in our research programs, that we're not fully understanding and appreciating. We're not somehow using, at that time, mostly graduate students from other countries very well. We weren't having them address the questions that they had to address when they went home very effectively. And many of our leading researchers, including myself, we didn't include a very global or international dimension in some of our research. And so I began to write about that a little bit, just kind of not for journals, but thinking pieces.
Yes.
And I've gone back and looked at those, and I thought,
that's interesting.
wow, that was in 1971, 72. And it struck me as I was onto something, but I was really naive and amateurish about it.
Right.
Because nobody, it just wasn't part of our thinking at that time. So as I began to continue my research and teaching in the economics of agricultural development, which is really focused on low-income country agricultural development, it just became natural. And I was rather early in my career when they asked me to begin to give leadership to the international dimension of the College of Agriculture at that time at the University of Illinois. And we had just gotten a lot of money to do some things, and I thought, this is good. I'm going to be able to be creative and do some things. And so I didn't realize that that step would take me out of a mainline research and teaching career.
It changes your career totally.
That's right. And so I began to do much more leadership and management and international affairs. And then...
and was that okay with you, that it changed your career totally? Because it does. You don't have time for research and publishing.
Absolutely. And it wasn't okay with me for a while, because I knew I wanted to become a full professor honestly.
Yeah.
And so I did. I put them off as much as I could, worked hard at publications and teaching and graduate students and all that, and became legitimately a full professor, obviously tenured and so on. So it was, I wanted to do that. I wanted to be able to claim that faculty status honestly and credibly.
And do you think that faculty status is important?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. At a place like University of Illinois, it was.
I agree.
Very important. And my colleagues, after I decided to go into leadership at the campus level, they would come up and say, you know, you've gone over to the dark side, Earl. You've really...
The dark side, oh my gosh.
You've neglected that stuff.
Yeah.
But part of it was joking, part of it was a little serious.
But it gives you the credibility to speak as a peer.
Oh yeah, they knew I had been through it. I had to go through the tenure process. I had to teach, I had to do research, I had to publish. So it wasn't like, you know, you come flying in from some other institution and not understanding this faculty process at all. But then I ended up being asked to be leading a group of universities and became the president of a consortium of universities.
What was it called, the consortium?
It was called the Consortium for International Development.
Oh, I know that, right, yes.
And it was 11 public universities in the West. But before that, I should say, and the one that really gave me my major professor credentials in terms of publications and knowledge was the Ford Foundation asked me to go give leadership to not only a research program in northern Thailand, but also an institution building. And so myself and another professor of agronomy developed what is now known as the Cropping Systems Program at Chiang Mai University. And we started with almost nothing, and it has become an institution now. And it gives master's degrees in cropping systems and farming systems. Even American students go there for master's.
Wow.
So it's really been fulfilling to see how that nothing developed into a very significant contribution.
Right.
So then I became the president of this consortium for international development.
And you were still at Illinois?
No,
in
this
that role?
was headquartered in Tucson, Arizona.
So you actually left Illinois?
I left Illinois.
And gave up tenure?
I did. And so I was at SID, as they call it, in Tucson, for about 6 years, and it was a wonderful time. We did a lot of science and education projects in engineering, in medicine, in agriculture, in water resources, Middle East.
And it really was international development. It's a whole other component of internationalization.
Absolutely. And then they called me up from the Rockefeller group and said, we want you to come give us program leadership at Winrock International. I don't know if you've heard of Winrock.
I don't know Winrock. I've heard the name.
Winrock International is a 501c3, an NGO that was developed by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations and big endowments. And we did international science and education projects and human resource development around the world. We had lots of employees all over the world. And so I was the senior vice president and chief operating officer of Winrock International for about 6 years. And then the University of Illinois developed this new thing. They call it the Associate Provost for International Affairs. And they called me up and said, you need to come home. Well, I had left, but they all
called it home.
Nice to have been referred to as my home. And so we began to explore that, and I began to realize, I was trying to figure out how did this happen, because there was nothing like this. And the president of the Chancellor of the University of Illinois was a sociologist, but he had a very international interest, but it was much more Western European collaboration. And he said, we really need to have some leadership in this whole arena. And so he appointed, I thought he did a very interesting thing. He appointed the most prestigious dean on campus to lead a process of defining what this might be. This was the dean of engineering. He didn't have any major international credibility, but he knew intellectually it was important, and everybody on that campus respected him. So whatever this group developed, the chancellor knew would be much more acceptable.
Right.
And so the dean put together this vision for this position called Associate Provost for International Affairs. And they called me up, and these back in the days in which or how you call it, they said, if you apply, we're pretty sure we'd like to have you, but we have to do a national search. And so they did a national search, and I interviewed along with other people, and they selected me. So I really began developing that whole thing pretty much from ground zero, and that was really exciting.
It must have been great fun, and also quite different from some of what you had been doing.
Because, as you pointed out, Joan, the international development piece, which I was heavily involved in as a teacher and a researcher, and as a leader in these other institutions, was not a very big piece of all this other stuff.
That's right.
But as I look back at my early assistant professor musings and his writings, I started thinking about, we need our students to understand this better, and we ought to send them places, and we ought to bring people from there here. So I began to realize that there was a lot richer context that needed to be developed in international education than just development. And so I was fortunate we had a study abroad office that was there, and it was starting to operate. We had a few other things happening, but it really needed a lot of vision and leadership, and I had good provosts and chancellors who supported it. And so I was able to get a lot of good support, and we were able to develop this idea, and it turned out to be a wonderful period of my life. And it was the last 8 years that I was in the university, and so I kind of capped off my career, if you will, in that way. And so that's kind of the story, if you will, about how I got to where I did.
And actually, you went on to do some other things after Illinois. Want to talk about them a bit?
Well, interestingly, I came back to the University of Illinois in this new position.
Right.
And I got a call, and I thought, I got to find out who are my colleagues. And so I heard about this AIEA thing, and I said, I probably ought to join that. And I joined it for a couple of years, and then all of a sudden you get a call, and they said, would you please be willing to run for president?
Right.
And I said, well, I tell you what, I'd like to run for past president. How about that?
That's great. I love that.
No, you have to start.
Right.
So I was elected and was president of the association for, well, that presidential stream is a 3-year
Right.
term. And that really helped me. In those days, we were much more of a smaller kind of conference. We really spent a lot of time just talking with each other. We didn't have huge numbers of sponsors. The time that I was the incoming president, I put the program together, which is typical for incoming presidents. And I put together a resource fair, which started the exhibition that
Right.
we now have, just as a way to help us understand there are a lot of other resources out there than just our own brains and our own faculty.
Right.
And so, but it's grown into much more sophisticated in place than that. And I really began to, I remember I thought it was very helpful to get some thought leaders to present to us. And so I invited Professor Amy Chu from Yale, professor of law. She wrote a book called, I forget, it was something like Democracy Burning, or at any rate, it was essentially the thesis of her book was, if you really want democracy in the United States, and you get it, you better watch out, because it's going to be a really interesting ride.
And it has
she was.
proven to be true, yes.
So she spoke and she captivated us because she began to think about with us in a broader sense the big issues before us in international and global affairs.
Right.
And we began to elevate our thinking about the bigger issues rather than sort of how do you get money for study abroad and how do you do international partnerships and how do you make sure the student visas are all right and those more operational but important questions.
Important, especially when it was a new
Right.
field.
Yeah.
And you all were really creating it.
And so we began to think about broader issues and more stimulating kinds of conversation.
So it was the second level of growth for AIEA.
And then after I retired, I got contacted by what was the precursor of strategic consulting, and they said, oh, we'd love for you to be their senior vice president and chief operating officer. And I said, what does that mean? And they said, well, this is one of the things we want to expand, and we want you to be our international leader and all this. And I said, you don't understand. I'm retiring. If I wanted to work all the time, I would have stayed in my job at Illinois, which I loved. And then I said, well, I would be happy to help on a specific project or two. And they said, okay, great. They knew they were going to. And so now I'm much more involved and getting involved. But I also do a lot of consulting for, I don't know if you know the Millennium Challenge Corporation. It's a part of it's part of the U.S. government in the State Department. And I'm the lead consultant for developing higher education in Georgia, the Republic of Georgia.
Right.
And we're going to start thinking about Liberia, I'm told, soon.
We were just talking about that in the past interview about Liberia. Introduce you to somebody later.
Good. So I've been heavily involved in starting a new university in Georgia as a lead higher education consultant. And the strategic consultant, we do a lot of work on helping universities develop strategies for strengthening the international dimensions of their institutions. We also help them recruit the best senior international staff that they need.
Right.
And so it's been an exciting run. I characterize it, when I first got into academia and began to think there was something about this international dimension that wasn't well thought out yet, it was a tough sell. I mean, there were not very many leaders in academia that really understood that or even wanted to talk about it.
Right.
And then, as you know, I went away for 12 years.
Right.
Out to SID and then to Winrock and then back. And I came back and it was very different atmosphere. It was an atmosphere then of, we don't know what the heck this is, but we figure it's going to be important.
Right.
So it was a teachable moment.
Right.
And I was able to come in and be engaged in this wonderful opportunity when people thought it was important but didn't quite know what to do about it. versus when I left, nobody thought it was important. I was on a bully pulpit mostly. And the second time back, it was much more, okay, let's think about this and work it out. So it was a nice change in those 12 years,
Right.
Particularly in senior leadership thinking.
So talk a little bit about that. What do you do when you go into a university that has nothing? And you're talking about consulting today on how to strengthen internationalization. What are the kinds of issues you talk about, and what are the kinds of strategies that can exist to help institutions? What should they be doing? What did you do at Illinois, and what do you recommend?
Well, that's a good question, and what I've learned is, and we've done now 30 or so universities, each of them is different. If you go in there with a cookie cutter, here's the form and we need to check this off and check, that isn't going to work.
Right.
It's amazing how the different cultures in different universities change what you would recommend. So the first thing we have to do is to study that university pretty thoroughly.
Right.
On the web, talking to senior leadership, talking to faculty and deans and so forth. And almost always, one of the things that you will hear from faculty all the way to senior leadership is, we really don't have a strategy. We got something happening over here, and I think somebody's doing something over there. And we found out the other day that we got 3 things going on in Peru, none of which know about each other.
Right.
And so you've got these pockets of things that faculty in their creative ways will develop, but there's no sense of what are the institutional priorities in global affairs. How should we, well, first of all, what should be those priorities? How do we encourage faculty and department heads and deans to work towards these priorities? So we often come up to a place and say, look, we need to sit down and do a planning process.
Right.
Now, I think strategic plans are important, but I've seen too many institutions plan, and after a year and a half, you sort of say, what's happened? And so there's a point at which you have to do something.
Yes, absolutely.
So the strategic plan is one thing. And I have found, at least in universities, most presidents and provosts get study abroad. They kind of understand why that's important and how it might lead to some things they're interested in. So we, a lot of times, start with that. We also start with the fact that you're accepting international students and you're having students study abroad. Those 2 things have possible consequences that you don't want to live with if you don't have good staff to deal with that.
Right.
You don't want a young woman going to country X being raped and then all of a sudden you're in court because you didn't protect your students, or you didn't prepare them, or you don't want an international student on your campus that somebody from Homeland Security will pick up next week and so forth. So we try to help senior leadership who may not be interested in the intellectual and conceptual part of it understand there's some serious consequences if you don't put good staff together. We also help them. It'd be surprising, a lot of presidents come into academia not as faculty rising to it, but from other places. And so they may not fully appreciate the concept of internationalization as a way to general excellence. So what we often do is say to presidents and provosts, what are your institutional goals? Now, what we would like to do is to help you achieve those goals with international dimension contributing to them. And so it's not like we're trying to say, here's an international dimension, and somehow it's kind of important in and of itself. It's important because it's going to make you a better institution.
Right.
So you talk about the institutional excellence that flows out of international and global affairs. And then they begin to say, oh, I'm going to be able to do what I really like to do and what I think is important through these kinds of activities and programs. And they become much more supportive of the notion than if they think it's kind of off here in a separate corner by itself.
Right.
And that's a kind of a strategy we use to energize the senior leadership. So those are again, depends on the institution you're talking with, but those are some of the things that we kind of started with and work with as we go ahead.
What you're describing is probably what the thought process was that you went through when you went to Illinois.
Yeah, yeah.
And then built a structure that is now incredibly successful.
Well, when I left Illinois, we were the only institution that was in the top 10 in study abroad, in number of international faculty, and number of international area study centers.
Wow.
So
you can feel very proud of what you contributed.
We had a good run. Now, I didn't do that by myself.
Of course, I understand, but you should be proud of it.
The provosts and the president and the chancellor were very supportive, and we had really wonderful faculty. And they did such wonderful jobs at developing proposals and making compelling cases. And we raised a lot of money through our foundation.
Which is not typical.
Right, and we found out that there was extraordinary interest in international affairs in many of the people that you would typically go to money for.
Right.
Many people of wealth understand this, maybe more than some of our faculty do, that the global dimension is important. And we also started an international alumni program. And one of the things that struck me as I got there, in Illinois, like many universities, have had a large number of international students for many years. And so we kind of on the back of the envelope started adding up, how many international alumni do you think we have? And when you kind of look at it and get a reasonable number, you went, oh my goodness, that's thousands and thousands.
And what a phenomenal resource.
And very prestigious people. So one day I was in my office thinking about, we got to figure out a way to capitalize on this wonderful resource for our own institution and communicate with our chancellors and provosts. Why don't we start an International Alumni Award program? Somehow recognize the distinguished international alumni we have. So I was just musing about this, and one of my friends came in the office who was a very wealthy guy. He was a professor at Illinois for years, and then he went to Southern Cal, and then he went to Emory. And he was a very high-powered business professor and also a high-powered consultant. And I think he had family money as well. And I just said, hey, Jag, I got an idea. What do you think of this? I just need your feedback. Does this make sense to you? And I outlined this. I said, what if we would ask for nominations for International Alumni Awards, and then we would bring the person that was selected back to campus, have a banquet, and celebrate her or his accomplishments. And he said, that's a great idea. I'll endow it.
Wow. I mean, hey, that's pretty cool. That does not happen usually.
It was the easiest money ever raised.
Wow.
And even today, it's Jagdish and Marjorie Sheth Foundation International Alumni Award for us.
Right.
And we've expanded it now, and so it's now not only recognizing international alumni, but now we recognize young faculty who've contributed, recognize graduate students.
Oh, that's lovely.
And it's become this big international award banquet, but it started, and the very first one we had was scheduled for September the 12th, 2001.
Oh my goodness.
And 9/11 happened the day before it was.
Right.
And so the first person that we selected was a woman from Japan, who was the only woman who had ever been a minister in the government of Japan. Wow. She was a University of Illinois alumna. And so we flew her back, and I had one of my staff go up to Chicago to collect her and drive down to Champaign. We could have flown her down.
She must have come in before September 11th.
And her was the last plane that landed at O'Hare before they shut it down.
Oh my God.
And she and this young woman didn't know what had happened, because they're talking as they're driving back down to Champaign about all kinds of things. And they got there, and I said, well, do you know what's happened? They said, well, what's happened? And I told them. And so it was, in some sense, it was an interesting juxtaposition.
Of course.
We were having this big banquet the next night on the wonderful international collaboration and connections of the University of Illinois, and we had to shut it down. Our provost, who was going to chair it, got stuck in LA, couldn't get back. Our chancellor was someplace else, they essentially, as you know,
Yeah.
they shut down all the air traffic, and we sort of said, we can't really have a celebration, this was a tragedy. And so we had this small gathering in which we sat in a smaller room with maybe 30 people and gave this poor woman her award.
Right.
It wasn't a very, but since then it always.
I'm sure she appreciated the circumstances of it.
Oh yeah, but it was kind of an interesting happening in terms of the time. And I remember I was in charge of that one because nobody else was happy to be there. And we talked about this is indicative of why we're in this business. We have got to find ways to be much more engaged with each other, and while we won't agree, but at least we have to develop relationships.
Which brings you back to your baseball game.
Why I started in the first place.
That's right.
So it was a really interesting kind of cycle for me.
Right.
And that program now is, was it 2014, last year it was the 13th one, and
right.
Next year it'll be the 14th.
That's wonderful.
One. And there are many people in those big award banquets now that don't even know what the origin of this
How it
was.
started. Right, which is a really interesting story.
It is.
So I actually wanted to ask you about one other project I believe you were involved with, and that is APLU.
Yes.
And tell me a little bit about the work you did there. We've talked with one of the other people who actually is at an association, and the associations do some very interesting things.
The Association for Public and Land Universities was known before as NASULGIT, National Association of State University and Land Colleges. I say that because some of the people watching this may not,
know that,
who were in an earlier year, may not know what APLU is.
Right.
And APLU has a president, well, I'm the backup, and it's the Public University Association, and I think it's the largest and oldest one of university associations in Washington. And so they end up being involved with a number of the other higher education associations on various things.
Right.
And I got started really with them in an informal way. I mean, like all of us, we went to their meetings and so forth. But they had a program that they had proposed, not just APLU, or NASULGIT, but other associations with AID, and said, why don't you provide us resources and we'll find a way to deliver the best people into projects from higher education. Excuse me. And so they did have this, and it was called the Association Liaison Office, ALO, and they had a grant from AID. And they realized they needed an advisory committee, and so we had university faculty, an association representatives from the other public education, or from the other higher education associations. And I chaired that for about 7 years. And partly because it
Was that while you were at Illinois?
focused, yes. Partly because it was focused on development, and that was sort of
right. So it brought you back to that part of your career.
And then it became higher education and development, HED.
Yes, and that's what I was familiar with.
Right. And then I thought, gee, 7 years, you know, somebody else's term surely, isn't it? And then APLU began to say, we really would like to have you do a lot more sort of thinking and working with us on international affairs, so would you be a senior fellow? And so I have, and I helped, worked with Peter, and we started something called the Partners in Poverty in Africa.
Africa, yes.
And that partnership was very successful, continues today. It was a partnership to bring the African voice to American, mostly development assistance policy, but also foreign policy, and so the African voice is now much more organized and relevant for agricultural development particularly. And then we also started something called the African Higher Education for Development Program. And that has also taken off in terms of developing resources to provide to universities who want to partner with universities in other countries.
Right.
And so, we have just finished about a 130-page report on how is it most effective, how could USAID most effectively contribute to the development of higher education in Africa. So this
Has that been published?
Yes. Well, I shouldn't say that.
Or is
it has
on the
been
website?
finished, and sent to AID. It's their
okay.
product, it's not our product.
Right.
And I'm sure you can get it on the web, and Claire Hervey and I and one other person wrote it.
Okay.
And so that's another kind of thing I did, and I helped them start the African Higher Education Initiative, from which the knowledge, this was actually done from the Knowledge Center for African Higher Education for Development. And now Peter is interested in trying to get additional study abroad participation from APLU institutions, so he's asked me to think about the study abroad initiatives and how. So those are some of the kind of things I do as senior fellow.
So you have been able to bring all the aspects of your own career to bear and continuing to contribute to international education and the scope of its definition.
Well, and one of the things as you think about the future, you know it's going to be really different. And that's exciting.
Yes. And how do you think about the future?
I think about the future as being a future that's much more strategic for universities and global affairs. We, as I kind of intimated, we kind of did projects and we had activities. And so in strategic consult, we're trying to raise that to a more strategic development.
Right.
But I can see now what's happening is we're getting provosts, presidents, chancellors, deans, understanding this more strategic approach. And so I think the future is going to be universities thinking about this, how would I say it, outside or on top of or above the Global Affairs Office.
Right.
And so one of our challenges as senior international officers is to how to be engaged in that, because it may well be the presidents are going to start talking about this and think they have invented this.
Right, of course.
And we're going to get left on the sidelines. So one of our challenges in the future is let's be a voice and make this globalization of higher education more meaningful, not only for other nations and universities, but for our own. And so if you don't watch out, senior national officers will be left as the presidents and government officials talk about this set of issues. So that's one of our challenges.
That's really interesting.
I think another challenge will be we have so much more technology now, and we don't really understand as well as we should how to move that into some extremely creative and innovative kind of international and global programs. E-learning, one of the chapters of this big report we just finished for AID was what's the role of e-learning in African higher education development. And it can be significant. It can be significant. It's a struggle. And it's not just a struggle of technology and wide enough bandwidth and all that. It's a struggle with many nations on their policies towards internet access, toward information technology. And it's also what we call a last mile problem. You can get big bandwidth into Nairobi, but how do you get it out to Village X?
Right.
So it's that last mile challenge. And you can bring people into Nairobi, but the genius of this will be when it gets much more level and democratic, as Thomas Friedman talks about.
Right.
And cell phones and all of this. So there's a wonderful, see, African higher education is faced with enormous challenges, something American higher education never really had to face. And that is this enormous increase in demand in a fairly short period of time. If you think about those big African population growth rates 18 years ago, they're now 18 years old.
Right.
And they're coming into the higher education system, and all of a sudden, they're facing these huge cohorts of students ready to do higher education. Number two, there's been some economic development in Africa, and people now have more money. So now they're coming back into higher education. Not just the 18-year-olds, but the 25 and so forth. And thirdly, you have places in Africa saying, I don't want to hire you if you don't have an undergraduate degree. So the credential things come back. And so if you would go to the University of Illinois and you'd say, we had about, let's just say 45,000 students. And you'd say, Mr. Chancellor or Ms. Chancellor, in 5 years, you could have 125,000 students on this campus. Illinois wouldn't know what the heck to do with that. I mean, it would be an enormous challenge.
Right.
And that's
What they're facing, with very few resources to begin
with their resources that are rather limited. And so this e-learning thing, this whole idea of how do you accommodate this incredible increase in demand with some sense of quality is a wonderful challenge, and one that I think we ought to be working with our colleagues in Africa working on. And it's not just in Africa, it's just that happens to be where I know most about it. So that's another kind of wonderful challenge. And I think we've got to do a lot better job at, one of the things I've learned in all of this is students learn from students.
Mm-hmm.
And we may not do as well as we ought to at internationalizing student interaction. And that, one of the things I did, at least, or I helped develop and give leadership to, was this international living and learning community.
Yes.
And so I hired Raj Mahan Gandhi, who was Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, and brought him to Illinois, and he was the head of our International Living and Learning Community, and it's called Global Crossroads. And so we purposely said, half of you have to come from outside the U.S., and half of you have to come from the U.S. And they lived together, and they learned together, and so it was a wonderful kind of a wonderful kind of activity. But that was just a small piece, because it only affected about 200 or 300 students. How do you bring together a political science class to sit down with a political science class in France, or with a political science class in Vietnam?
Right.
Or you can just go on, or other kinds of disciplines. We don't do that well enough yet, and I think e-learning is going to give us a chance to do that more effectively. I think we have, we're starting to do a lot more in branch campuses abroad. We don't have that figured out. I think we need to do a lot better job in that thinking. We have now much more pressure and institutional interest from opening universities in the U.S. from universities. I just talked to somebody recently about a Mexican university who wants to open a branch campus in the U.S.
Which is really interesting. Yeah. And why not?
Sure. Because theoretically, it ought to work the same. Americans get a little nervous about that.
Right.
But why not? And so these are the kind of opportunities. And then this whole technology that allows us to be synchronously in the same space, and even asynchronously, is something I'm not sure we've done enough with in international and global affairs. So we haven't done enough with having our own faculty spend significant amounts of time in other countries, becoming much more knowledgeable about what their specialties act like and deal with. For example, if you're a medical professor in medicine, wouldn't it be great to go to Zambia and spend some time looking at the kind of, or a professor of veterinary medicine.
Yeah.
These diseases know no borders, as we found out with Ebola.
That's right.
And, or if you're really interested in political science, how in the heck is this Vietnamese group going to come working through all of this? And
right.
What does that mean for American foreign policy? And you can give hundreds of examples. We haven't put together the kind of more resident of our faculty being engaged in other countries and maybe exchanging and bringing their faculty here. That whole milieu of international scholarship at a higher excellence level. And I think we also, one of the things that I found it easy to sell at Illinois was getting our world-class departments and professors to engage in collaborative research networks with other world-class people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we do not have we have not captured all of the knowledge in a specific topic. We may think we have, but we haven't. And so the French, the British, the Russians, the Japanese, the Australians will have different takes. And so we started something at Illinois with the CNRS in France, and it brought together a computer science and computer engineering and many of our highly technical areas to work with the very best French had to offer. And that really became a wonderful way to do two things. One is a wonderful way to collaborate on important research and get new perspectives and ideas. And many patents came out of that collaboration. But it also became a way to get faculty from the University of Illinois to Paris.
Yeah.
Or to Lyon, or to Cambridge. And as wonderful a place as Champaign-Urbana is, it is in Paris. And if our faculty could say, whoa, you know, if I work here and I become engaged, I can be in London, I can go to France, I can go to Paris, I can go to Tokyo. It was a kind of a way to provide our own faculty a sense of not only being engaged intellectually in it, but actually having a more global life.
Experiential, right.
And many of them value that as part of their professional development and their own personal development.
Right.
So it became a way for us to get more engagement, buy-in from some of the Nobel Prize kind of candidates. And often, if you don't watch out, you kind of leave those folks out because you don't quite know.
You don't think that they, right, exactly.
But there's another example of it. We signed a research agreement with CONACYT in Mexico. And as I was negotiating it, I asked him, what's your priority? What is the most important thing to Mexico in your research program? And they said diabetes, just boom.
Wow, that's so interesting.
And so I said, okay, well, let's do something on diabetes. And so we developed a biotech nutrition kind of research lab focus on diabetes, and our faculty went there, their faculty came to Illinois. And so we developed this collaboration and research, bringing in the world-class people. And we got a call from the head of CONACYT one day. I got a call and he said, do you have a really well-known scientist there that could come and talk to the president of Mexico about science and technology? Tell me more. I'm not quite sure what you're asking. There were strong signals that this was several years ago. The president of Mexico was not very impressed with science and didn't think it was as important as obviously people in CONACYT did. And they wanted to get somebody that he could not ignore. So it happened to be that year we had 2 Nobel Prize winners at Illinois, and one of them was in medicine and one of them was in physics. And the one in medicine was not a very articulate guy, very brilliant, but really different and not easy to understand in many ways. But the physicist was a very, very articulate, wise kind of guy. And I sat and talked with him and I said, here's an opportunity. Would you like to sit with the president of Mexico and talk with him about why it's important? If you do that, you're not going to be talking about high energy physics. You got to be talking about science in a broader sense. So he thought about it. He said, yeah, I'll do that. And so he went down to Mexico and sat with the president and talked about the importance of science and society.
International education. Oh my goodness.
And I guess what I'm saying is there's so much serendipity in this. Get out there, get engaged, be involved, and then you begin to see these wonderful opportunities that open up. And so now my advice to students who want to get career advice is do a really good job at your first job and watch doors that open and decide you want to walk through that door or not. And if you do a really good job in that door. And you got to realize you've shut some other doors when you do that. But that's kind of a sequential kind of an excellence that will probably lead you where you want to go. And so it's been a fun and wild ride.
That's a wonderful way to end this interview because you've talked about the meaning of it to you when you started, the meaning of it to you at the end, the challenges we still face, the challenges organizations like AIEA will face, and you're talking to this new generation and saying, hey, these doors will open and you can be the next generation to do these things and make these changes.
And my advice in that regard is a lot of students sometimes want to do some kind of a degree that's hard to know what you do with it. That's okay, but I also think do something that's in a fairly well-established discipline and get really good at it. And then you begin to open up, you can open
Doors
up
that you never
doors.
thought.
And so it's not only, you can major in international relations or international affairs, and that's fine too. But just because you want to do your PhD or your master's degree in civil engineering, you can still do meaningful work in international affairs, but you just need to do it really well and keep watching for doors that open in other places.
Well, you've helped open doors for many people, so thank you for that and for this interview.
You're most welcome.
Thank you.